Okay, my name is Matthew Pauly, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of History at Michigan State University in East Lansing, Michigan. I am a specialist on Ukrainian history. I approached this through many years of study of Ukrainian, spent a fair amount of time in Ukraine and just got back from Ukraine. Seems like not that long ago, but I suppose it was in January. I returned from a Fulbright I had in Ukraine and Odessa. And we're here to talk about Breaking the Tongue, which is my most recent monograph. It is about the intersection between the Communist Party's program for the promotion of the Ukrainian language and innovation in education. So the way in which progressive pedagogy worked with a nationalities policy sponsored by the Communist Party and pushed rather hard by national communists in Ukraine. I would like to make the argument that this is the most sort of detailed study of Soviet nationalities policy on a local level. So in Ukraine, we could talk about different elements of nationalities policy, but that element of it which applied to ethnic Ukrainians was called Ukrainization. And I would suggest that this study really tries to get down as much as possible to the ground level and the perspective of those who were entrusted with promoting the policy at the local level. So I think in so doing, we get away from sort of higher level party debates and look at what was actually achieved and what sort of obstacles did the so-called Ukrainizers encounter. And there were many. It did not go swimmingly in spite of the sincere desire, I believe, on parts of the Communist Party. Certainly, we can debate just how much Kharkiv was behind Ukrainization and Moscow beyond it. But my sense from doing this sort of very detailed research is there were absolutely committed Soviet officials who wanted to see the promotion of Ukrainian culture and pushed hard for the promotion of Ukrainian culture and for the transformation of schools. So my book looks particularly at primary schools. When one talks about education in the early Soviet period, it's a really complicated topic. Ukraine had a distinct system of education. It was distinct from that in Russia. The officials in the Ukrainian Commissariat of Education believed essentially that Ukraine was a country, republic devastated by the Civil War and Revolution, right? And they needed to bring the republic back as quickly as possible and train a workforce for building the economy. So they introduced a level of professionalization at an earlier time than that in Russia. So secondary schooling was dedicated to professional education. I'd argue that primary schooling, although it promoted some sort of general education, it still was meant to link up with a secondary program of very professional or vocational oriented education. Scholars who've written on Ukrainization in the past have looked to schooling as a place of remarkable success. And if one looks at the statistics in terms of the number of schools that transferred over to Ukrainian language instruction relative to the population, it is by and large a success. In fact, the proportion of Ukrainian schools slightly exceeded that of the ethnic Ukrainian population so it got to approximately 80% of primary schools converted to Ukrainian language instruction. But many of these schools were just four-year schools, so they were truncated primary schools. And there's continual concern raised in files largely from local sections of public education, that is, local bodies responsible for education that were directed from the Commissariat of Education in Kharkiv, but had some degree of autonomy to dictate educational concerns in regards to what they met on the ground. there's continued frustration with the level of Ukrainian language instruction, with resistance that was manifested by teachers and certainly by parents, largely in urban spaces, who resisted the notion of sending their children to Ukrainian schools, or more appropriately, I suppose, resisted the conversion of what they felt was their school to Ukrainian language instruction. So technically, everyone was supposed to have access to education in their own language, and this presumed then sort of an ethnic division of children. So ethnic Russians were supposed to go to Russian school, Ukrainians were supposed to go to Ukrainian school, Jews were supposed to go to Yiddish schools. In practice, things got often lost in the mix. Children were in schools that were in the midst of being converted, and some ethnic Ukrainians who identified themselves as Ukrainians but were Russophone, Russian-speaking, resisted the transfer of their children to Ukrainian language school, or resisted the conversion of their school to Ukrainian. So anyhow, it was not an easy or automatic process. And throughout the 20s and well into the early 1930s, there was concern raised about the quality of instruction and issues of enrollment as well, just how many Ukrainian children were attending school what they viewed as full 7-year primary school. So Ukrainian children were not doing this in the numbers that education officials wanted. So Ukrainization was partly about the linguistic conversion of the school, but it was also really about offering education to children that would situate them to advance up the education ladder. Ukrainization, the promotion of Ukrainian culture, was supposed to ultimately enable the growth of a Ukrainian working class, right? I mean, the Communist Party cares about the working class, and they care about industrialization in Ukraine's cities. So they want peasant migrants, coming from the countryside to encounter a Ukrainian linguistic environment in the cities. But there were all sorts of debates within the party against or about the possibility of forcibly Ukrainianizing the proletariat or the working class, and that was a taboo. You weren't supposed to force workers to speak Ukrainian if they didn't want to. But the runaround for this, I argue in the book, was to encourage as much as possible for children of Ukrainian workers to go to Ukrainian schools, even if they spoke Russian at home and may have lived in the city. Maybe their family had lived in a city like Kiev-Kharkiv for a couple of generations. Still, if they identified as Ukrainian, the state believed them to be Ukrainian. They wanted them to go to Ukrainian schools. In fact, they were initially assigned to Ukrainian schools. So parents had to push back against the state's presumption that Ukrainian children should go to Ukrainian schools, right? So they're first assigned to Ukrainian schools, and then they had to sort of, parents had to take it upon themselves to combat that assumption. So yes, it's the linguistic conversion of schools, particularly schools. The Commissariat of Education and its local affiliates didn't want just schools on the sort of outskirts of cities to be converted to Ukrainian, but they wanted very prestigious former gymnasia, the most prestigious schools in the center of every city. At least some proportion of those should be Ukrainian as well. So it was about the conversion of institutions, but also about the conversion of linguistic habits of so-called Russified Ukrainians in the cities. And then in the countryside, where you have a largely Ukrainian-speaking peasant population, it was about teaching appropriate, proper standard literary Ukrainian to these children, and for them to develop a modern sensibility of what it meant to be Ukrainian, right? So there was a de-emphasis on sort of ethnographic characteristics of what the Ukrainian nation meant, and really an emphasis on Ukraine's participation in larger Soviet effort to industrialize, and then all rural schools were supposed to have some sort of patronage by an urban school. So there was supposed to be a linkage between the rural primary school experience and urban primary school experience through correspondence between students, but also ideally peasant children were supposed to visit the city with their school and see their ethnic kinsmen operating in Ukrainian in cities like the Republican capital of Kharkiv. So I presume most of your viewers probably know that education was not permissible in the Ukrainian language during the Tsarist period, right? So this is one reason why Ukrainization was such a novelty. Some success was achieved under the various national governments that existed during the so-called Ukrainian Revolution, right? So under the Central Rada and the Ukrainian People's Republic, this process was started. A great amount was achieved, even under Skoropadsky's so-called Ukrainian state or hetmanate. That is in terms of sort of setting up the institution of a Ministry of Education, promoting Ukrainian language instruction at the highest level as post-secondary education. But, because of the circumstances of war, much of this stuff I think was really on paper, and teachers who were active Ukrainizers during the Ukrainian Revolution didn't often know which way the political wind was blowing, right? The political stability just wasn't there to really change the linguistic experience of children in schools, and to truly build a ladder of an educational system from the primary school to the university, all in Ukrainian. This was a legacy that the Communist Party had to deal with once it finally gained complete control and permanent control, or at least permanent for 70 decades, right? Once they came into power, they had to deal with the fact that there was a constituency in Ukraine that supported aspects of nationalities programs such as Ukrainization. And they also benefited, one could argue, from the support of national communists. There was always, there's all sorts of debate on this in circles that I exist in, of just how much there was real cooperation between national communists, former members of the Borobisti Party, and Ukrainian Communist Party, who eventually were forced to merge with the Communist Party Bolshevik of Ukraine. But many of these figures ended up in the Commissariat of Education and were leading promoters of Ukrainization. And for even the Communist Party's leadership in Moscow, there was a logic to educating children in a language they understood. So it meant that the education would be that much more efficient, and the results would be much more durable. There was dispute of just how far this primary school seemed to be something that all Communist Party members could agree upon. Just how far Ukrainian language instruction would stretch was a matter of dispute. But formally, Ukrainization extended to the university what was called the the Institute of Public Education, Institut Narodnej Osvity, and every aspect, every ladder, or every rung in the ladder of education was supposed to Ukrainize. And as I said in my initial remarks, what was distinct about the Ukrainian system of education was that it was a 7-year primary school followed by a 2-year secondary school. and then called a proshkola, or professional. I translated in my book as vocational school. And that was, it was, bureaucrats in the Commissariat of Education said it wasn't purely vocational, but it was certainly directed towards preparation for employment in a specific sphere of industry. And that came at a very early date, age 15, 16, for Ukrainian children. And then after that, they could go to a technicum, a technical school, or to an Institute of Public Education, which was the Soviet replacement of the university. So the argument was that the country was devastated by war. They needed a workforce as rapidly as possible, and they designed an educational system trained to do so. And then I suppose the other aspect that I talk about in the book is that there was, in the initial years, right, and even at the end of the Civil War, there were all sorts of children's buildings set up, ditbudinki, set up by the Soviets for children who were orphaned or semi-orphaned, whose parents simply didn't have the means to house and clothe them. And these existed in the Russian Republic, but they were, I would argue, even more important in Ukraine because of the devastation of war. And because of the legacy of these children's buildings, I think the Ukrainian Commissariat of Education presumed, to even greater degree than the Russian Commissariat of Education, that the state had a right to really intervene in the raising of children. So this notion of really sort of, as much as possible, the state presuming it knew what was right for children and trying to push aside the family and the decisions of parents was an even stronger trend in Ukraine because what we call conventionally the Russian Civil War was really fought on the territory of Ukraine, and some scholars, in fact, don't like the term Civil War at all. They see it as there was multiple forces, but certainly there was an aspect of a Ukrainian-Russian war that existed as well. So what is understood is the party-level debates, right? Party-level debates over Ukrainization. James Mace wrote a seminal book on this, and obviously there's been an interest in Ukrainian national communism for a long time. But truly understanding what happened when you get down to the level of a particular city or community, that we only really achieved when the archives were opened in the 1990s, and it takes a lot of diligent work to sift through all this stuff. So, there are files that are easily labeled. So you get a file directory, and you see in the description files associated with nationalities, policy, or Ukrainization. And I think Ukrainian scholars have written largely from those files. But what you really need to do is just examine a whole wealth of files that have simply to do with public education or primary school education, and sift through them looking for references to Ukrainization. So I have a chapter that's on Odessa. It's sort of my case study. Although we get down to the level of the city and the town in multiple chapters, but I chose Odessa as a place to sort of highlight the challenges of Ukrainization because it was the least ethnically Ukrainian city. I found from working in files in Kyiv, that is files with the Republican level of the Commissariat of Education, that education was highly contested in the South. Ukrainian language education was highly contested in the South. So in Odessa, I used an Oblast archive there as well as the Kyiv Oblast archive. But Odessa, I just found you could really get into the mind of the Ukrainizers and see what some of the obstacles were. So one of my big finds in Odessa was I knew that Ukrainian teachers assigned to Ukrainian school, and they may have been there when a school was Russian and then converted to Ukrainian, and they were employed they were hired by a Ukrainian school. But some teachers found themselves in the midst of this process. Anyhow, they were constantly evaluated for their Ukrainian language knowledge. And in Odessa, I actually found these, not just sort of how they did, you could find those even in the central archival collection. But in Odessa, at the Oblast level, I found the essays that they wrote to demonstrate their Ukrainian language knowledge. And they weren't just, I would suggest, just about their knowledge of Ukrainian, but it was about their comprehension and embrace of the program of Ukrainization. So one question they were asked in one of these Ukrainization exams was, what was the political meaning? How do you understand the political meaning of Ukrainization? And you could see the mark of the person that in the Commissary of Education who graded these essays, and they read dobra, dusha, dobra, and it really didn't. I mean, I'm not a linguist, right? So I would be very ill prepared, and I'm not a native Ukrainian speaker. I would be very ill prepared to distinguish their fine knowledge of Ukraine. I could understand them. I knew what they were saying. But to me, the high marks always seem to be associated with a real embrace of the program of Ukrainization, some sort of self-reflection. One teacher wrote, I don't know how I ever taught Ukrainian children in Russian. What was I thinking that was utterly undemocratic and inefficient and unproductive thing to do. So teachers who got high marks for recognizing the sort of correctness of this policy. And so I think in many ways the institutional support I got for writing this book and publishing it ultimately was about trying to understand how ordinary people who lived in Ukraine, not just ethnic Ukrainians, obviously, but people who lived in Ukraine at that time understood Ukrainization, and teachers were, I would argue, at the forefront of this policy. So a lot of what we have examined before is, sort of polemics on high. But Ukrainization, if we slow down and really sift through the archival record, was about very real humans who were entrusted with immense responsibility and immense authority. So when things seemed to go, when there was a perception that things were going awry, these people got in trouble. But the reality was, in spite of the importance of Ukrainization or Ukrainization, this is a very decentralized process. So orders were given in Kharkiv, but it was really up to regional level officials, and really, I would argue, up to individual teachers to make sure that it succeeded. So much so that there was a big emphasis on Ukrainization in the South and the East, but there was no real central coordination of hiring of teachers, right? So when one would presume that the Republican authorities sitting in Kharkiv would be interested in making sure that Ukrainian-speaking teachers from the central or what was then western parts of Ukraine would be interested in transferring them over to these areas that needed Ukrainian teachers. But in fact, the local in Odessa or in Stalino, they had to petition constantly and work out with other local level authorities in Vinnytsia or elsewhere. Could you send some teachers over? Right? Nothing seemed to be done through Kharkiv. So it's that sort of local lens that I'm trying to pursue in this book. Use of textbooks was frowned upon in this area at this time period. So most certainly there was effort to translate existing Russian language textbooks into Ukrainian and to use and create and author new Ukrainian books that teachers would then employ in the classroom. But what was promoted at this time was a method of progressive pedagogy called the complex method, where it was really up to the individual teachers to cluster lessons in biology and mathematics and literature around set themes. And they created modules for teaching these things to and it was supposed to be in response also to the interests of the children. So the children were also involved in the designing and implementation of curriculum. So they were trying to really get away from what they viewed as the formalistic sort of education that was promoted under the Tsarist period, where kids learned things by rote, memorized tracts of books, stood up and said them what our vision of later Soviet education was like. And I argue in the book that partly this benefited Ukrainization in the sense that there was a shortage of Ukrainian language literature, and I constantly talk about in the book local officials and teachers saying we need more. But on the other hand, because there was such a de-emphasis on reliance on specific books that needed to be used, this created a place for a competent Ukrainian language teacher to design a curriculum that they felt was best. So in the absence of a sort of existing repository of text authored in the national language, teachers were asked to innovate. Now, it was a double-edged sword, right? So they were given great authority to do this, but they weren't really capably trained to do this. Only the best teachers were, and they were really largely based in the cities. And other teachers who got these instructions about progressive pedagogy and the complex method didn't know what to do with it. And then I suggest in the book that as time proceeded, the Communist Party began to worry about this authority that they'd given teachers, right? They had too much independence to define what would happen in the classroom, both in terms of what children would learn, and then I would argue also the way in which Ukrainian language was taught and what sort of aspects of, as you referenced, Ukrainian history, other what we would largely considered Ukrainiznawstwo, right? Ukrainian studies, which children were supposed to master and teachers also had to demonstrate in their examinations to the state. They began to worry what the content of that Ukrainian studies, those Ukrainian studies lessons were. I was surprised. So I went looking, I suppose, for evidence that this fundamentally changed the sort of national orientation of Ukrainians who didn't think of themselves in national terms. And we do see some evidence of that. But I suppose I went into it understanding this previous historiography, which suggested that things went very well in the schools in terms of Ukrainization. And I was surprised that it didn't. I expected some indication of resistance, but I was surprised by the number of files that I encountered that suggested high levels of resistance, particularly in cities, right? In the countryside, there you see much greater evidence of acclaim. Teachers are struggling to adapt to the new orthography as defined by Kharkiv and to these strange instructions for pursuing a progressive pedagogy that they didn't entirely understand. But there's a fair amount of resistance. One can understand that, I think, if you sort of one has to question what the archival material is, right? It's natural, I think, that we see when there's problems, people talk about them, and that appears in the archival record, right? When there's an absence of problems, that's somewhat harder to find. But even more than that, I'd say it's this issue of decentralization. To me, given what happened, that is that ultimately many of these teachers were swept up in arrests associated with the trial against the so-called Union for Liberation of Ukraine, Spilka Vyzvolenia Ukrainy, and the sort of polemics you see by the mid-1930s, but even earlier than that, against nationalist teachers. I was surprised that the state didn't have more control over the process, that it wasn't more centrally directed than it was. So I was frustrated working in Kyiv in the central governmental and party archives. Because getting what is sent to the center but you don't get information about deliberations at the local level. And then the other big, huge gap that exists is we really, in Odessa, at other oblast archives, but certainly in Kyiv, you don't have a great picture of what education was like in the 1930s. So I make some conclusions. I have to go about it partly through, I have a couple chapters on young pioneers in the Komsomol, so those records are more complete in the 1930s, and so that's how I approach the 1930s. I also make some judgments about the 1930s on the basis of what I found in the early 1930s, that they were continuing to, education officials were continuing to cry about unsatisfactory Ukrainian language levels among teachers, and about poor quality Ukrainian language instruction. So the argument I make is, okay, if that's the case in the early 1930s, when you have a Ukrainian national communist like Mykola Skrypnik still in power, what's it going to be like later? I think it's when we talk about that a great proportion of Ukrainian language, ethnic Ukrainians receive Ukrainian language instruction in the mid to late 30s. I think we need to question what that education was like, given that the tide by then had changed, and that there was a high suspicion of people who promoted aspects of Ukrainian culture too much, right? So it doesn't mean it didn't exist. It certainly did at the primary school level, but the incentives for really truly mastering Ukrainian and using it past the primary school level, certainly at the level of higher education, were very few by the mid to late 1930s. So the archival record is unfortunately missing for the later part of the 1930s. I think so. We have to be tentative about the conclusions we make. So I do examine the repression against teachers. I make the argument that I think that the tide turned quite a bit earlier than this famous November 1934 plenum, which suggested that Ukrainian nationalism or local nationalism was the preeminent danger to Soviet power in Ukraine. I suggest that things went downhill earlier, as early as the 1930 show trial for the Union of Liberation of Ukraine, where many prominent Ukrainizers, including teachers, were arrested and put on trial and talked about widely in the press. And these included leading advocates of Ukrainization and progressive pedagogy, like Volodymyr Dodakivsky, who was a very famous Ukrainian teacher. He ran what was called he ran the first Ukrainian gymnasium in Kyiv, and it was later called Taras Shevchenko Labor School Number 1. And he was supposed to be the way that this Union of Liberation of Ukraine was structured, I think, was purposeful. So it was structured by the GPU to include a school section, because I suggest they were worried truly about what was going on in the school, and they were worried about what the next generation was going to look like. What were these kids being taught in the school by largely non-Communist Party teachers? So I argue that because of this trial and sort of its notoriety and the way in which it was publicized throughout the Republic, that there was absolutely no real gain from pushing Ukrainian language knowledge or really spending teachers lived desperate lives, right? They weren't paid that much. And we're almost sidestepping this huge issue of the famine that I argue still hasn't been, there's been a lot talked about the famine of Holodomor, but we still don't have a huge understanding, I think, enough of how this affected schooling. But even before that, there were desperate times for teachers. So were they going to spend their free time perfecting their Ukrainian so they could perform on these exams? And I suggest not. So that the strength and the vigor of this policy of Ukrainization was robbed at an earlier date. And then there's the other issue, I suppose, that I have to deal with in my own work, and I've talked to my colleagues about, that is whether this policy was just a sham, right? Was this just a sham to suggest maybe to Ukrainians living in Poland, Ukrainian diaspora beyond, or to the rest of the world, that the Soviet Union was a democratic state interested in the national interests of non-Russians? And certainly, I think it's hard to suggest. It's easy to suggest that the secret police, the KPU, was the most un-Ukrainized institution and very anti-Ukrainization. But there were certainly voices of support for rollback of Ukrainization in the party as well. But if this was the case, a huge amount of effort was spent on promoting Ukrainization, right? So if one takes the time, as I did, looking through the massive number of files of people whose lives were dedicated to the pursuit of creating Ukrainian language schools, perfecting the use of Ukrainian in schools, ensuring teachers knew Ukrainian well, it's hard to see it as insincere. And I also would argue that that the goalposts changed during the course of this time period, right? It's hard to argue what the policy was in 1923 was the policy in 25, and so on, right? I don't know. I mean, even in Odessa, I found some evidence that parents were changing their mind about the prospect of a Ukrainian language education. That is, that they saw real reason for their children to learn in Ukrainian, because that seemed to be the way the Republic was headed, right? If you wanted good, gainful employment high up in the Soviet bureaucracy in Ukraine, you needed to know Ukrainian. So the potential, I think, was out there for Ukraine and Kyiv maybe going the way of Prague and Riga and these other places where issues of language were in dispute. Ukraine today is not the Ukraine of 1923 when Ukrainization began. That there was a very high proportion of people who just spoke Ukrainian, and there wasn't this sort of mutual intelligibility between Ukrainian speakers and Russian speakers, right? I mean, one could learn Russian when they came to the city, but it would take effort, right? And it's not the same sort of, I don't think you would have these strange conversations as much as you do witness today, where, you have two TV presenters and one speaking in Ukrainian, one speaking in Russian, and there's a conversation that happens between them. Right. So I have had this pushback when I give talks, right? The languages are so close. Yes, but it's no closer to Ukrainian and Czech, or I mean that in that time the Ukrainian speaker was a Ukrainian speaker, and it did take study and it took stepping outside of oneself to really learn Russian and to learn it well and use it well. So there is a process of Russification that definitely happened, and Ukrainian language was restricted. Its use was restricted, and I think we need to acknowledge that and continue to support the promotion of Ukrainian where possible. And certainly, I think at the highest levels of education, Ukrainian needs to, state-funded institutions need to use the state language, in my opinion. Obviously, Ukrainians themselves will sort this out. But the other thing, I suppose, is that, we are many years since 1991. And one could argue that not enough effort was spent on contemporary Ukrainization. But one can't help but be pessimistic, I suppose, given the amount of time that has passed. And the sort of the way in which Ukrainian language has been used. That being said, I'm a frustrated Ukrainian speaker often. I spent all this time in Odessa. I do speak Russian when I have to, but I prefer to speak Ukrainian, and just because that's the way I was trained. This is the kind of research I do, and I deal with Ukrainian historians in Kyiv, and we speak Ukrainian for the most part. So I would say, as a frustrated speaker of Ukrainian, I have been happy to see Ukrainian spreading among the younger generation, spending some time in Kyiv and using Ukrainian quite easily. But as far as specific educational reforms, I don't know what to suggest to the Minister of Education. There was potential in this process of Ukrainization, Ukrainizacija, in spite of, I spent a fair amount of time in the book talking about its problems. Partly that's what the archival record is telling me, and I'm pushing it back against the presumption that things were just automatic in the schools, right? Things it did require effort. It probably could have succeeded even more had it had the sort of central support that the policy needed. But there was potential for the Ukrainian language to be considered the language that one needed to know, regardless of ethnicity. I mean, I think it was good and appropriate for the Soviets to guarantee the rights of other national minorities in Ukraine to get an education in their language, but they always conditioned this with the obligation that they learn Ukrainian as well. And so there was, I think, at the high point of Ukrainization, which I would say is really not that long, maybe 27 or something like that. There was a recognition that one needed to know Ukrainian, and Ukrainian was the language spoken by the majority ethnic community in the Republic, and regardless of one's ethnicity, one needed to be able to operate in that language. So I would just say that there was a moment of promise here, but there was always a paradoxical policy that there was deep uncertainty about what its ultimate objectives would be and what degree of political support there was for it. So I don't view it as insincere, but I view it as a policy shorn apart really by its paradoxes. Okay, great. Thanks, William. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.